Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 37, Daniel Morgan, the Bushranger. Daniel Morgan has been described as the most bloodthirsty ruffian that ever took to the bush in Australia. Many accounts of his activities, particularly in the years after his death, emphasise his brutality and erratic behaviour. But Morgan had many sympathisers and informants in the districts where he carried out his activities. He was an expert bushman with superb horse riding skills, and a combination of those abilities enabled him to evade capture by the authorities for a significant period of time. Just a warning, there are graphic descriptions referring to the aftermath of Daniel Morgan's death in this episode. Daniel Morgan was born on the 30th of April 1830. He was born either John Owen or Jack Fuller, the illegitimate son of George Fuller and Mary Owen, and he was born at Appin in New South Wales. His mother was locally known as the Gypsy due to her darker complexion, and George Fuller was a costermonger, or a person who sells fruits and vegetables from a handcart in the street. Other sources claim that Morgan's father was an ex-convict called Samuel Moran, and an article in 1908 refers to Morgan as Samuel Moran. Other researchers believe that Morgan was really William Moran Jr., the son of two convicts who was born in New South Wales in 1833 and was raised around Campbelltown. From the age of 2 until 17, Daniel Morgan was known as John Owen and was raised by a man called John Roberts, known in the Campbelltown district as Jack the Welshman. Owen, as he was known at the time, attended a Catholic school at Campbelltown, but was considered a ne'er-do-well. He was categorised as having antisocial tendencies. Society had little charm for him. Bush and solitude were his delight. He had a great affinity with animals, in particular horses, which allowed him to become a horseman with great ability. In about 1847, aged 17 years, he found employment as a stockman on a station in the Murrumbidgee district. It was reputed that he developed into a horse and cattle dealer, his practice being to drive his captors long distance and sell them. Those who came into contact with him said he had a very quick temper. In 1854, Morgan was back in Campbelltown, staying at Jack the Welshman's hut. Idling for some months, he decided to visit his mother in Ballarat, whom had married after his father died. He stole a horse from a police magistrate. He was reportedly chased for some miles by Campbelltown police, but he eluded them. It is said that when they were trotting their horses after him, he kept at the same pace they did, and when they galloped, he used to put spurs to his horse and outstrip them in speed. He at last managed to double on them, and returning to the neighbourhood of Campbelltown, succeeded in stealing 2 more horses, with which he made his way into the interior where he disposed of them. His known criminal record began on the 19th of June 1854 when, under the name John Smith, occupation jockey, he stuck up 2 travelling hawkers in the Castlemaine district in Victoria and left them tied up to trees. The police followed his tracks and captured him after a desperate resistance. He was sentenced to 12 years hard labour for highway robbery. He was sent to the Hulk Success at Williamstown, and while he was working at a quarry near where the Success was berthed, Morgan lost the top of one of his fingers in an accident. The finger was jammed between a heavy bar and the stone they were lifting. He got his ticket of leave in June 1860 for good behaviour and was sent to the Yakadanda district south of Albury. Morgan later claimed that he had gone to Yakadanda where he asked a man for a job, which was refused him on the account of him having been at Pentridge, and that he then determined never again to ask for employment. He failed to report to the police in the Ovens district and was proclaimed to be a prisoner of the Crown illegally at large. Morgan entered upon a continual course of crime. Identified as Jack down the river, appropriate to his prisoner illegally at large status, he visited a pastoral run in the Murray district that belonged to Dr. J.P. Rowe. The doctor was absent at the time and he stole his gold watch. From there he proceeded to Evans's Whitfield station in the Upper King Valley, 25 miles south of Wangaratta, where he stole a prized horse. After that, Jack, as he was known at the time, stole a saddle and another horse from the Bonds Bongamiro station. From there he went to Mount Typo station, owned by Mrs. Warren and Oakey, where he obtained shelter for the night. In the morning, after the men had departed to round up stray cattle, Morgan helped himself to as many provisions and blankets as he could carry. The squatters, Evan Evans and Edmund Bond, and a group of men set out in pursuit and at last discovered the gentlemen camped at the base of a steep range. Morgan managed to escape up the slope, where the pursuers were unable to follow with their horses, but not before Bond succeeded in getting a shot at him, wounding Morgan in his upper left arm. He escaped into the Eastern Riverina. This would become his base, although he frequently crossed into northeastern Victoria, a pattern common amongst those involved in the cross-border stolen stock trade. During the next few years, the outlaw kept a relatively low profile, supposedly engaged in horse and cattle stealing and occasionally engaging himself as a horsebreaker. On the 17th of June 1863, Robert Morton, a squatter from Wagga, and Morris Brach, a hawker from Beechworth, were camped at Walla Walla, about 30 miles from Albury. Two men rode up to the camp, one of them armed with a double-barrel gun and a revolver, and told them to bail up. The robbers took £30 worth of goods and money from Brach and 4 £1 notes and some nuggets from Morton. When Morgan was asked whether he had any connection with the hawker, Brach and he answered no. The money and nuggets were returned to him. While this was going on, John Manson of Beechworth drove up and the robbers stuck him up as well. One of the robbers was supposed to be a man named Morgan, alias Beardy, and it was reported that both men were splendidly mounted. The following day, on the 18th of June 1863, 4 young men were held up and robbed at Post's Cookendina station east of Henty, the robbers fitting the description of Morgan and his accomplice. The young men had been proceeding from 10 Mile Creek to attend some buy races at Merritt's Cookendina Inn. They were robbed of 3 racehorses, together with the saddles and bridles, and 15 shillings of cash. Morgan's companion in these crimes was variously known as Flash Clark or German Bill. On the 29th of July 1863, Jack Morgan, as he was known at this time, and his companion arrived at Wallendale Station west of Henty and stuck up 2 overseers and tied them to trees. They then proceeded to the homestead and accosted the squatter Gilbank. Morgan and his accomplice then made a deliberate survey of the premises, and the result of their foray was that they rode off clear with 2 horses, saddle and bridle, and other property which took their fancy, at the estimated loss to Mr. Gilbank of some £65. Even at that stage, Morgan's fatalistic attitude was evident. During the robbery, he was reported to have said, "I expect I'll be shortly taken, so I may as well go the whole hog." The description of Morgan given to police after the Wallendale robbery was as follows: 35 years of age, 6 foot, long black hair, curly at ends, bushy beard and moustache, brownish in colour, rather knocked-kneed, wrinkled nose but not pock-marked, had on check trousers too short for him. Both Morgan and Flash Clark wore hairy coats and rode fine grey horses and carried carbines in buckets. Morgan had been known by a bewildering variety of aliases during his life, including John Smith, Sydney Bill, Billy the Native, Warrigal, Dan the Breaker, Down the River Jack, Beardy, Jack Morgan, and most famously Daniel Morgan. By the time of his bushranging activities from mid-1863, the name Morgan was the identifier that was used in most colonial newspapers. On the 20th of August 1863, the police magistrate of Wagga, Henry Bayliss, was travelling to Urana on official business when he was stopped about midday by 2 rascals armed with double guns and revolvers and ordered to surrender his money or his life. Bayliss responded by galloping away, but after a chase of several miles, the bushrangers caught up with him. On discovering the identity of their captive, Morgan returned the money and watch he'd taken from him. Instead of tying Bayliss up to a tree, the bushrangers opted to cut down a telegraph pole, cutting direct communication between Urana and Wagga. When he arrived at Urana, Bayliss telegraphed Wagga Wagga via Melbourne, and the police there, headed by Sub-Inspector Morrow, set out and joined the police magistrate in Urana, after which Bayliss and the policemen set off in pursuit of Morgan and his companion. On the afternoon of the 21st of August 1863, a Mr. Scott was travelling with sheep near Bullingong when he was held up by two men and robbed of £4 and 4 shillings, a watch, a ring and a new saddle. The watch and ring were afterwards returned. The robbers were identified as the same men who had carried out the Wallendale robbery. On this occasion, Morgan was identified as Jack Morgan, alias Big Morgan. On Wednesday, August the 26th, the police contingent led by Henry Bayliss discovered Morgan's camp in the dense scrub, about 7 miles from the Urangelang Creek. Sub-Inspector Morrow, Trooper Brown and Bayliss remained at the camp to await the bushrangers' return. It appears that Morgan had notice of the movements of the police and after nightfall stalked the campsite for the purpose of surprising the police. Towards midnight, the police heard a noise in the scrub. Bayliss went to investigate but had not advanced 3 yards before a discharge of firearms took place in front, close to his person, and he fell instantly. Trooper Brown returned fire in the direction of the flashes of the ruffian's guns, but the bushrangers escaped. Bayliss had received a bullet through his right breast, which exited from his left shoulder, leaving a fearful opening. The police magistrate eventually recovered, though he continued to suffer from the effects of the injury. The bullet that had passed through his body was later presented to Bayliss enclosed in a gold casket, which he wore suspended from his watch chain. In 1875, the colonial government presented Bayliss with a gold medal for his gallant and faithful service. On the day following the wounding of Bayliss, a shepherd named Haley, in the employment of Henry Osborne at Brookong Station, was fired upon and dangerously wounded by armed men. This incident was later included in a published list of crimes perpetrated by Daniel Morgan, in apparent retribution for the shepherd providing information to police regarding the location of the bushrangers' camp. The events of the night of August 26 did not go well for the bushrangers. Flash Clark had been severely wounded in the exchange of gunfire, and Morgan had to assist him to escape. He took Clark to an isolated location on Mahonga Station, southeast of Urana, where Flash Clark died. A decomposed body was found on the run several years later, supposedly wearing the black coat that Clark had worn on the night of the shooting. As a result of the wounding of Henry Bayliss, the New South Wales government offered a reward of £200 for any person who shall give such information as will lead to the apprehension of the offender. Morgan frequently targeted the region's squatters, especially those who were believed to be hard masters, and delighted in humiliating them. During raids, he insisted that his employees be fed and given drink. On the morning of 3rd of November 1863, Daniel Morgan, now operating alone, arrived at Gibson's Burrumbuttock Station, 35 miles northwest of Albury. The squatter, Thomas Gibson, was absent, but Morgan made himself comfortable in the house by ordering breakfast and sending one of the men to fetch up Mr. Gibson's favourite horse. Before leaving, he changed his clothes and put on one of Gibson's suits. Erratic, Morgan was often nervous, and his moods could swing rapidly from almost courtly treatment of prisoners to threats, rage and violence, hence his sobriquet Mad Dan. Although he was sometimes assisted by companions during his hold-ups, accomplices differed from robbery to robbery, and he often worked alone. He was an imposing man. As mentioned before, he was 6 foot tall. He had dark hair that he wore in ringlets. He had a full dark beard, dark eyes and a long hooked nose, which some claimed made him look like a ferocious bird of prey. Riding Gibson's horse, he went to the public house at Piney Range, where he had drinks with some of the patrons before proceeding to nearby Walbundry Station, where he stuck up Thomas Kidson and stole a chestnut horse called Euclid. Morgan then proceeded to Bulgandra Station, another one of Thomas Gibson's runs, where Gibson was supervising shearing. After announcing he was now Mr. Gibson, Morgan ordered the shearers from the shed and told the overseer Smith to prepare for death, as he would not see Morrow's son. However, the overseer's wife pleaded with the bushranger, saying if he killed her husband, he must kill her and the child too and have 3 murders to account for. Her pleas were successful in saving her husband's life. Morgan then took Gibson into the house and made him sign 9 cheques of £30 for each of the shearers, one for £95 for Morgan himself, and another for £15 to pay a man to go to town and get them cashed. When the man returned with the money, Morgan departed. Early the following morning, Daniel Morgan called on the Stitt brothers at Walla Walla Station and helped himself to various articles which struck his fancy. While there, he compelled the proprietor to bring rum to the woolshed and treated all the shearers. Morgan pointedly inquired about how the shearers were being treated and instructed them to acquaint him if they were ill-used, as he was always to be found thereabouts. 2 days later, on the 6th of November, Morgan visited Elizabeth Vincent's Mittagong station near the Rock, where he accosted Isaac Vincent, Elizabeth's son, and accused him of providing information to the police. Morgan instructed one of the shearers to tie Vincent to a fence post so he could enjoy the spectacle of the place being burnt down. One of the men was then ordered to set fire to the woolshed. Morgan himself then set fire to the station store. While the store was burning, he called to one of the men to get out a bag of flour, as he did not want to leave them starving. Morgan then rode away, commanding all at the station to remain in place till the following morning, when he would return. The next morning, in accordance with his promise, he returned and inspected them as a general of division would. After eating breakfast at the station, Morgan departed. In January 1864, Thomas Henty's Arab horse was stolen in the night from Round Hill Station, east of Culcan, a theft for which Morgan was suspected. Later, the superintendent of the station, Ingram, met Daniel Morgan near Cookardenia. Morgan accused Ingram of spreading a report that he'd stolen the Arab horse and affected much virtuous indignation at the scandal. Morgan then stole Ingram's mount, after which he informed the superintendent where Henty's Arab horse could be found. On the 2nd of April 1864, Morgan stuck up the mail between 10 Mile Creek at Holbrook and Tumbarumba and stole a horse from the mail contractor. Afterwards, it was reported he was seen enjoying himself at 10 Mile Creek without experiencing hindrance from either police or civilians. 3 days later, Morgan and another man stuck up 2 men named Elliot and Donnelly, 20 miles from Narrandera on the Jerilderie Road. Morgan's companion was shorter in height with a sandy complexion and carried a double-barrelled gun. The men were robbed of money, a horse, a saddle and a bridle. The men did not report the crime when they arrived at Jerilderie, and it was only later, after a routine police inquiry, that a report was made. The reason given by one of the men for the reluctance to report the incident was fear of retribution. This incident is the first time Morgan was reported with an accomplice since the death of Clark in August 1863. On the morning of the 12th of April 1864, Morgan called at William Haynes's Jerilderie station and bailed up 3 men. Before departing that evening, he exchanged his black mare for a grey mare belonging to Haynes. A subsequent article in the Deniliquin Pastoral Times newspaper expressed disquiet at the delay in the provision of information about this incident to police, and the article concluded, "It is clear that if this class of intimidated men is to increase largely, the capture of criminals will become indeed hopeless." On the 2nd of June 1864, D.F. Johnston and 2 other men, while driving stock to Melbourne, were camped at the Round Hill station and were bailed up by Daniel Morgan. He robbed Johnston of money and a gold watch, and afterwards selected a fine black mare, saddle and bridle before making his departure. The turning point came on the 19th of June 1864, when Morgan arrived again at the Round Hill station, east of Culcan, and those present at the homestead were the superintendent Samuel Watson, his wife, the overseer McNeil, the cattle overseer John McLean, and the son of a neighbouring squatter, John Heriot. With a revolver in each hand, cocked and capped, Morgan demanded that the liquor supplies, consisting of 6 bottles of gin, be produced. He insisted that his captives join him in drinking gin, to an extent that all involved were probably inebriated, and after ordering a meal be served to him, he rounded up the station personnel in the cattle shed. After inspecting the station's horses, the bushranger mounted his horse to leave. At that point, the superintendent Watson rather rashly made a comment that Morgan's stirrup irons had been stolen. Morgan coolly turned around in his saddle, took deliberate aim at Mr. Watson's head and fired. Watson put up his hand, through which the ball passed, and then the bullet grazed his scalp. Watson ran behind the shed and Morgan fired 2 more shots, one which hit John Heriot's lower leg, shattering the bone into pieces. Suddenly taking pity on Heriot, the bushranger, who seemed to act with the inconsistency of drunkenness or of a murderer gone mad, swore a fearful oath that he would blow the brains out of every man on the station if they did not come to Heriot's assistance. At this time, 2 men made their appearance, evidently Morgan's men. One of them described as a half-caste Aboriginal. Morgan supervised Heriot, being made as comfortable as possible, at which point John McLean, seeing Morgan apparently relenting, as if satiated with bloodshed, asked him if he might go for a doctor. The bushranger answered yes, but soon afterwards had second thoughts. He set out to follow McLean along the road, overtook him 5 or 6 miles down from the station, and without yea or nay coming close behind him, shot him in the back above the hip. Morgan dismounted and lifted the mortally wounded man onto his horse and led him back to the station. Morgan and his men then remained carousing until 2 o'clock the next morning, when they departed as they came. The police under Superintendent McCleary arrived just 5 minutes after the bushrangers left. John McLean remained at Round Hill, where he died of his wounds on the 22nd of June and was buried in the Albury Cemetery. On June the 24th, Sergeant David McGinnity and Constable Charles Churchley encountered Morgan about 15 miles east of Tumbarumba when they were returning from Copperdella Station on the Old Coach Road. Seeing a man on a brown horse on the road ahead, McGinnity had cantered forward to investigate. When the sergeant got closer, Morgan pulled his hand from his jacket and fired. McGinnity's horse was startled by the sound of the shot and rushed into thick scrub beside the road. Morgan's horse wheeled off in the opposite direction as Constable Churchley fired 2 shots from his revolver. Churchley claimed to have searched the thick scrubby country for signs of McGinnity's whereabouts, but as his horse was completely knocked up, he eventually led it back to Coppabella so he could borrow a fresh horse. Churchley revisited the scene of the encounter but lost the tracks of McGinnity's horse. On the road back to Tumbarumba, Churchley encountered Morgan, who galloped across the road about 20 yards ahead. The bushranger fired a shot which passed through the side of Churchley's coat. This encounter enabled Churchley to positively identify Morgan as the assailant. Near Glenroy Station, Churchley saw Morgan a 3rd time and fired at him, although the distance was too great to have any effect. The next day, Churchley and his 3 young volunteers set off for Tumbarumba in search of McGinnity. That same morning, the mailman had discovered McGinnity's body a little off the road, about 6 miles from Coppabella Station. After meeting the mailman on the road, Churchley proceeded to the location. McGinnity's body was transferred to Tumbarumba via Glenroy Station. A magisterial inquiry into the incident was held at Tumbarumba Courthouse several days later, with the events leading to McGinnity's death based on the evidence of Constable Churchley's single eyewitness account. Sergeant David McGinnity was about 40 years of age and had left a wife and 4 young children to mourn his loss. Based on his evidence at the magisterial inquiry, questions have been raised about Constable Churchley's role in the affray, leading to accusations of cowardice on his part. 3 months after McGinnity's death, Churchley was found to be absent from his post at 10 Mile Creek after he'd visited a local hotel while he was supposed to be on guard duty. He was suspended and convicted of neglect of duty and fined £5. The location where the police sergeant was killed is known locally as McGinnity's Gap. As soon as the details of Sergeant McGinnity's death became known to the New South Wales government, there was a reward offered of £1,000 for such information as will lead to the apprehension of Daniel Morgan, who had been charged with the commission of numerous and serious offences and has hitherto eluded the events to apprehend him. The notification also detailed a reward of £100 for such information as will lead to the conviction of any person or persons harbouring, assisting or maintaining the above-named offender. On the 3rd of July, the policeman Sergeant Carroll and Constables Horrigan and Dalziel were riding through part of Charles Edgehill Station, northwest of Henty, when in the distance they caught sight of a man galloping away from an old hut occupied by the Corcoran family. This aroused the suspicions of the police, knowing Morgan was likely to be in the district. The police gave chase and engaged in an extended pursuit through the bush on the adjoining Wallendale station, during which Morgan's identity was confirmed. At one stage, Carroll managed to fire his revolver at Morgan, but the bushranger eventually escaped. The woman at Corcoran's hut alleged ignorance of Morgan, stating that the man that the police had seen leaving was a perfect stranger to them. On the night of the 4th of September 1864, 4 policemen from Albury, Senior Sergeant Thomas Smythe and 3 constables were encamped at the swamp on Thomas Kieran's Doodlecoma Run near Henty. Their tent had an open front before which a fire had been made, and about 9 p.m. the men were lying and resting on the ground inside the tent. Suddenly, a simultaneous volley of bullets fired into the tent, both from the opening and through the back. The policemen jumped to their feet and rushed outside. Smythe and Constable Connors returned fire into the darkness, and the firing continued on both sides. The others made a skirmish into the thick scrub, but without being able to come up to their cowardly assailants. On returning to the tent, the men found poor Smythe insensible and bleeding profusely with a bullet wound to his left shoulder. Smythe was taken to the station homestead and the next morning driven in a dog cart towards 10 Mile Creek for medical assistance. After a dreadful trip during which the dog cart driver lost his way in the bush, Smythe arrived at 10 Mile Creek, after which he was transferred to Albury. In Albury, the wounded Senior Sergeant Smythe gave evidence that he believed Morgan had ascertained that he was on his track and that he and some of his gang had crawled through the scrub up to the tent and, having made a survey, fired into it simultaneously. Smythe thought there were at least 3 assailants. He said all the firing occupied only a few moments and gives his companions credit for great courage and coolness. Despite Smythe's initial clarity of mind, in the end his wound proved to be fatal. On 3 occasions the wound had commenced to bleed afresh, and despite 2 doctors being in constant attendance on him, Thomas Smythe died on the 29th of September. 5 days after the attack on the policeman, Morgan had another narrow escape from the authorities. A group of 4 policemen sighted Morgan in the distance on King's Run, adjoining Edgehill Station. Sub-Inspector Zouch, who had the freshest horse, chased Morgan towards the Doodlecoma swamp, during which the bushranger, being hard-pressed, threw his rifle into the scrub, which proved to be the rifle that he had taken from McGinnity. Once again, however, Morgan managed to escape. In late October 1864, Morgan, in the company of 2 or 3 mates, stuck up Yarrabee Station, about 35 miles from Jerilderie. The occupants of the station were held hostage until the early hours of the following morning. At 3 o'clock in the morning on the 23rd of November 1864, the Deniliquin mail coach was stopped at Turangelina Scrub, about 43 miles from Wagga, by Daniel Morgan and another offender, and robbed of the mail bags. The mailman attested that Morgan opened most of the letters and then returned them. They took 2 horses. On the 11th of December 1864, Morgan made an appearance at a road contractor's camp at Kiamba, 14 miles southwest of Tarcutta. He bailed up all the men at the camp, and when it was discovered the contractor Adams had no cash on hand, he set fire to the tents. He ordered 5 Chinese men, described as miners, to strip, with a view to searching their garments. When they hesitated, perhaps not understanding his command, Morgan shot one of them in the arm just below the shoulder joint. The money he recovered was trifling, 1 small gold piece and about 30 shillings in silver. The latter he threw away. He remained there until 5 in the afternoon, having caused tea to be made and damper prepared for him. When Morgan left, he took several hostages with him, taking them over the mountain to 8 miles north of Kiamba at a location known as Kiamba Gap. There he held up 2 buggies, one belonging to Mr. Manson and his wife from Beechworth, and the other driven by 2 young men. After robbing the occupants, he then conversed freely for some hours, detailing his various exploits at great length, and dwelling particularly upon the murder of McGinnity and Smythe, at which he made no attempt to conceal. He spoke of 3 men whom he was determined to shoot before retiring from the business. The men named were Mr. Mackenzie, late of Mundaloo, Mr. McLaurin of Yarra Yarra, and Sergeant Carroll, each of whom he expressed himself determined to revenge. After Manson and his wife were allowed to depart, the mail coach to Albury arrived, but being very light, Morgan allowed it to pass after a mere formal examination. Shortly afterwards, the mail coach coming from Albury arrived. Morgan ordered the driver to stop, but this was not instantly complied with, and he fired a shot at him to bring him to. He then made the driver hold the horses' heads while he ramshacked the mails. 2 days later, 2 hawkers named Knight and Shane were stuck up by Morgan near Pulltop Station, west of Kiamba, and robbed of £60 worth of liquor and gold nuggets, as well as a horse, saddle and bridle. The hawkers had been well armed and had openly stated that they were not the least frightened of Morgan. However, the bushranger had watched their campsite during the night and bailed them up in the morning as they unhobbled their horses. As he was leaving, Morgan told them he could have shot the two of them the night before and not to be so cocksure of their defence in the future. Between January and March 1865, he was credited with no less than 6 major robberies of coaches and pastoral stations and the attempted murder of a stockkeeper at Wallendale Station. On the 9th of March 1865, a shepherd, John Pender, was quietly feeding his dogs at Wallendale Station, west of Henty, when he received a shot in the thigh from Morgan's revolver. Pender crawled to his hut, followed by the bushranger. Morgan told him he had mistaken the shepherd for someone else. Pender later gave evidence against Michael and James Corcoran, who were charged with aiding Morgan, and in the murder of Senior Sergeant Smythe, as well as being involved in his own wounding. On the 23rd of March 1865, Morgan stuck up the mail between Wagga and Urannah. He ransacked the bags and stole a number of letters. A week later, at 2 o'clock in the morning, on the 30th of March, Morgan stopped the mail coach from Albury on the road between Kiamba and Tarcutta. He detained the coach for 2 hours while he opened letters, but he managed to only find a small amount of cash. Morgan was next observed about a week afterwards in the neighbourhood of Tumbarumba and was then noticed to be making rapidly in the direction of the Murray, and thereafter he crossed into Victoria. Late in the afternoon on the 2nd of April 1865, Morgan made an appearance at Tallangatta Station, 24 miles southeast of Albury, from which many of the personnel were absent. The next morning, 2 horses were found to be missing from the stables, and it was supposed Morgan must have visited the place during the night. In March, the Government of New South Wales introduced the Felons Apprehensions Act, which made him an outlaw. In April, Morgan crossed the Murray to settle an old score with Evans and Bond. In late afternoon on April the 5th, Morgan arrived at McKinnon's Tonga Station on the Little River, about 25 miles from Yakadanda, and stuck up 10 men, including McKinnon. When he departed, he took a man from Tonga with him to guide him across the country. Travelling at night, Morgan next appeared at Roper's Mullen-Dollongong Station, about 15 miles to the southeast, where he compelled the services of another guide. From there, Morgan travelled southwest until he reached King Valley, south of Wangaratta. By early morning before daybreak on the 6th of April, Morgan arrived at the Evans Brothers Whitfield Station on the King River, 25 miles south of Wangaratta. The bushranger ignited some of the haystacks near the house, which roused the station inhabitants from their sleep. While they were gathered around in order to extinguish it, Morgan appeared from behind the kitchen, fired a gun and ordered them to bail up. Morgan asked about the whereabouts of Evan Evans and was told he was away from home. Morgan explained he particularly wished to see him and Mr. Bond of Degamiro Station, both of whom had pursued him in September 1860, from which incident he received a wound in his upper left arm. Morgan mentioned that New South Wales was getting too hot for him and that the bloody detectives were walking about the country in garb of peddlers. Before he departed at 9 o'clock in the morning, Morgan ordered a female servant to bring him 2 bottles of brandy. After he departed, a lad was dispatched to Wangaratta to inform the authorities. The following morning, the bushranger appeared on an adjoining run, the property of Mr. McBean, where in separate incidents he robbed a hawker and 3 draymen. At dusk, Morgan arrived at the small township of Winton between Benalla and Glenrowan, where he was recognised as he rode past Whitty's public house. During that night and the following Saturday morning on the 8th of April, Morgan was in possession of the road between Benalla and Glenrowan. He stopped nearly everyone he met, riding up to where the carriers were camped and forced them to disgorge. On the morning of the 8th of April 1865, Morgan left the main road and he cut across the country to the northwest, where he reached Warby's Dairy Station, after which he proceeded to the head station, Tamanick, about 10 miles due west of Wangaratta. Mr. Warby was absent, but Morgan was said to have behaved politely towards Mrs. Warby, and on taking his leave at about noon, he took a horse from the stables. By evening, Morgan had reached a road leading from a swamp past Rutherford and McPherson's Pichelba Station, with frontages on the Ovens and Murray rivers, about 20 miles northwest of Wangaratta. He met Mr. Telford and 2 other men and compelled them to accompany him to the Peachelba homestead. In the week or so since Daniel Morgan had entered Victoria, he travelled about 200 miles in a wide arc around the population centres of Albury, Beechworth and Wangaratta, and now he was within 7 miles of the Murray River. Morgan bailed up the co-owner of Peachelba Station, Ewan McPherson, and confined him, his wife and household staff, as well as Telford and the 2 other men in the parlour of the homestead. However, prior to being confined, one of the housemaids, Alice MacDonald, managed to get a message to one of the station hands that a stranger was in the house. The man ran to George Rutherford's house, located a quarter of a mile from McPherson's house. Rutherford was a co-owner of Peachelba, and Morgan was possibly unaware of the other house on the station. Rutherford, not knowing that the stranger was Morgan, was in 2 minds about how to proceed. Meanwhile, the household nurse, Alice Keenan, obtained permission to leave the parlour on the pretext of caring for a sick child. She ran over to the Rutherfords' house and informed them that the stranger was Daniel Morgan. On this news, Rutherford dispatched a man to Wangaratta requesting assistance. Inside McPherson's parlour, things were proceeding very quietly, with Morgan chatting with the inmates. Early in the evening, he asked Miss Rutherford and Miss McPherson to play the piano. Later, Morgan dozed in a chair with a revolver in one hand and another on the table in front of him, though Ewan McPherson perceived that the bushranger was not actually sleeping. On receiving Rutherford's message, the police magistrate at Wangaratta gathered a group of townsmen to accompany the constables Evans and Leverton to Peachelba Station, arriving at about 2 a.m. on Sunday the 9th of April. In the meantime, George Rutherford had collected together trusted station hands and armed them with any weapons that could be gathered. He gave the best guns to John Wendland and a young man named McIntosh, who were considered to be the crack shots on the station. When the men arrived from Wangaratta, it was decided to wait until Morgan made an appearance. In the morning, Morgan went into a bedroom and spent some time in dressing his beard and long hair, which he arranged in 4 curls. McPherson remarked that he seemed to bestow very much care on it, to which Morgan answered that a man must have something to be proud of. After eating breakfast, Morgan told McPherson he wished to borrow a horse. Fully armed, Morgan marched the men from the parlour into the veranda and around the garden fence to the stockyard. When Morgan appeared, the men waiting in ambush cautiously moved towards him. McPherson became aware of the planned ambush when he saw the men cautiously following. At the haystack where several horses were feeding, McPherson pointed out one of the animals to Morgan. While this was happening, John Wendland had moved up the garden fence a short distance ahead of the others. Without pausing, Wendland raised his gun and fired at the bushranger, in which he fell with a heavy thud to the earth. Wendland had shot the bushranger in the back near his shoulder blade, a bullet shattering his spine in its course and making an exit by the throat. 2 constables rushed forwards to the wounded bushranger and disarmed him, upon which Morgan reproached them for firing without giving him a chance. Gravely wounded, Morgan was taken to the woolshed. Detective William Mainwaring from Beechworth, who had arrived at Peachelba during the night, interviewed the dying bushranger and offered him some wine. The district coroner arrived from Wangaratta just after noon, but decided medical assistance would be ineffective. At one stage, Morgan said his right hand was cold, and at his request, one of the men present in the woolshed rubbed it for him. Morgan died at 1:45 p.m. on the 9th of April 1865, aged 34 years. By the time of Morgan's death at Peachelba in that early afternoon, a crowd of at least 50 onlookers had arrived at the station, most of them from Wangaratta. As soon as he died, several persons commenced cutting locks from his rather profuse head of hair, but Detective Mainwaring soon put a stop to this. While Morgan's body lay in the woolshed at Peachelba, his body was photographed by 2 photographers, Henry Pole of Chiltern and Mr. Hall of Beechworth. Pole's 2 photographs were posed as though Morgan was holding his revolver, one of them including John Wendland holding a rifle alongside the body. On the afternoon of the following day, Monday, April the 10th, an inquest regarding the death of Daniel Morgan was held at Wangaratta before a jury and the district coroner, Mr. W. Dobbin. During the inquest, John Wendland, who had shot Morgan, was asked by the district coroner if he wished to say anything, but was cautioned that anything he might say might be used in evidence against him. The reason for the wariness was that prior to the verdict of the inquest, Wendland was technically liable to be prosecuted for the Bushranger's murder. The following verdict was arrived at. The deceased, whom we believe to be Daniel Morgan, met his death from a gunshot wound inflicted by John Wendland on the 9th of April 1865 at Peach Elba Station on the Ovens River, and we further consider that the homicide was justifiable. We further consider that great praise is due to all concerned in the capture of the deceased. The following day, on the 11th of April, Morgan's body, wrapped in a wool bale bag, was brought into Wangaratta and placed on public display in a police cell. Later that afternoon, the body was removed to a shed where Dr. Henry of Benalla flayed the beard and underlying skin from the corpse's face using a clasp knife provided by Francis Cobham, Superintendent of Police at Benalla. Also present were Dr. Dobbin, District Coroner, and Dr. McKay of Tarrawingi. Dr. Henry then severed Morgan's head from its trunk. The remaining hair was then shaved from the head, it was washed in hot water, and a plaster cast was made. In May 1865, it was reported that the Attorney General of Victoria had suspended both Dr. Dobbin for removing the head of Morgan and Superintendent Cobham for the part he took in reference to the beard. However, both suspensions were only temporary. A later report stated the skin and beard from Morgan's face was made into a tobacco pouch. On April the 14th, Morgan's head was put in a box and sent to Melbourne by coach, where it was handed over to Professor Helford of Melbourne University for scientific study. After receiving the head, Helford stated that he had expressed no wish the remains of the wretched man should be so recklessly mangled, and the decomposition had set in so great to an extent that for any scientific purposes the head is quite useless. The newspaper report added that the decapitation appears to have been a most unwarranted piece of officiousness and excess of authority on the part of the local coroner, and is very much akin to the prurient and brutal feeling which resulted in the hair, beard and clothes of the deceased marauder being hawked for the delectation of the curious. Daniel Morgan's headless body was placed in a pine coffin and buried in the Wangaratta Cemetery. Morgan was denied a Christian burial. His remains were interred in the Chinese section of the cemetery. A description of his grave published in 1878 noted that a rose bush and geranium were growing at the head of the grave, planted by Morgan's mother, who up until 1876 had travelled from New South Wales once a year to visit the grave. The New South Wales Government reward of £1,000 for the capture of the offender Morgan was shared between 17 different people. The main recipients were John Wendland, the man who shot him, who received £300, Alice MacDonald, the housemaid who first conveyed the information about Morgan, £250, James Fraser, the volunteer who assisted soon after the shooting, £250, Donald Clark, a volunteer stationed near the house with Wendland, £100, and Alice Keenan, the nursemaid who informed Rutherford of Morgan's identity, £50. What remained of the reward money was evenly split between the 12 other volunteers and policemen who were involved in the confrontation at Peach Elba Station. In May and June 1865, notices were published addressed to the squatters of Riverina and Victoria, calling for subscriptions towards a fund for the benefit of John Wendland, who'd shot Morgan, the bushranger. A statement by Ewan McPherson of Peach Elba Station explained that Wendland had left the station at the recommendation of the police, who were concerned of the danger he was in if Morgan's friends avenged his death. Wendland had been employed at Peach Elba for 4 years prior to Morgan's shooting. During April 1865, the New South Wales Government passed legislation which was designed to facilitate the capture or killing of bushrangers to punish those who assist, harbour or provide sustenance to them. The legislation, called the Felons Apprehension Act, was specifically aimed at notorious bushrangers such as Daniel Morgan and Ben Hall, and effectively gave the public licence to shoot and kill such declared outlaws on sight without calling on them to surrender or requiring the commission of an offence. As it happened, Morgan was killed in Victoria at the time the legislation was passed through the New South Wales Parliament. However, the section of the Act dealing with those who would give shelter or sustenance to a declared outlaw had a deterrent and possibly a salutary effect on Morgan's previous associates and sympathisers, even though technically the Act would not apply to them. In June 1865, Inspector Singleton from Albury stated that about 30 persons suspected of harbouring Morgan and other similar characters have left their accustomed haunts and taken to honest pursuits since the Felons Apprehensions Act became law. Morgan's time at large owed much to his bush skills, an inept and undermanned police force, and an effective telegraph of sympathisers and supporters amongst the shepherds and stockmen in the region. There was also an element of fear. He had no hesitation in shooting two men that he believed were police informants. He passed into folklore, however, as the traveller's friend.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.